Welcome to the TOEIC TOEFL IBT Independent Writing Tasks, Day 4, Part 1. Our objectives for this video are to continue our review and expansion of Part 3, Writing the Body. Then we will discuss an important vocabulary tip on the concept of cohesion. We will discuss a particular test trick, and then participate in an activity. Then we will discuss the importance of paragraph unity. We will do another activity, and then it'll be your turn to focus on these two ideas. So again, in our part of the writing process, we've talked about Part 1, the planning stage, Part 2, writing the introduction, and began our discussion of Part 3, writing the body. As we said before, the body usually contains at minimum 2 paragraphs, focusing on 2 different reasons that you're trying to introduce in the essay. Each of these paragraphs shows how it connects to the thesis by using a topic sentence. This topic sentence will help introduce the reason you're trying to make. And then each topic sentence begins usually with an appropriate signal word or transition, and this will show how the paragraph fits into the overall essay. As we discussed last week, each personal example that we use needs to be relevant, which means that it relates to the topic very well. So part of this is making the right choice from the planning stage as to which ideas you think you might want to include. Also, each personal example you choose is logical. In other words, it's supported by other information in the paragraph and basically makes sense. And we also suggested that in terms of organizing the body paragraph, it might be a good idea to follow a certain organizational style, and one that shows especially how personal examples can connect to the reasons that are being used. So again, in this common graphic that we used last time, we talked about starting the paragraph with a topic sentence, and then immediately following with a personal example, and using some supporting details to help us understand them. Then we have a connection to the reason we're trying to make, and again include some supporting details for that, and finishing with sort of a mini conclusion to the paragraph. So again, let's return to our sample essay, talking about the difference between individual sports and team sports and which we think is better. Again, in our typical TOEFL TOEIC format, we have an introduction, a body, and conclusion to our essay. And again, as we were focusing on the body, we generally have 2 different paragraphs, each one beginning with a topic sentence. Now, of course, this is the minimum. Certainly, you can have more than 2 paragraphs in your body. And the body paragraph, we stated before, starts at the topic sentence, develops, and then finishes with a conclusion. So in the outline we developed a couple of weeks ago, we talked about in determining how the first topic sentence connects. We looked at it a little more carefully and actually demonstrated by using a body paragraph, a sample body paragraph that was created for this activity. So again, there's our topic sentence. About the first lesson we learned was teamwork. The next one involved our personal example with some supporting details. So this one focused on playing point guard on a basketball team and demonstrating how we had to know the strengths and weaknesses of our teammates in order to help set up our teammates on the court, and then of course sometimes know when we would have to take advantage of the situation. Then we had our connection to our main reason. And remember we said in our last video that this was a pretty long paragraph, so we decided to divide it into 2 paragraphs, which is perfectly fine. And then we followed our main reason with some more supporting details. And remember, this was the idea of connecting the goal of team sports to the real world, focusing on the teamwork that we have to use in most businesses and organizations. And then we finished with a mini conclusion, which we'll talk more about in our next video for this week. Now, getting to the idea of the paragraph and talking a little bit more about the vocabulary we use. The concept of cohesion is something that's very important and needs to be stressed at this moment since we're talking a lot about paragraph development. So what is cohesion? Well, it involves two things. One is using signal words, which we've talked about quite a bit with the topic sentence, but now we're going to focus on a little bit more inside of the paragraph and showing how different words and ideas relate to each other using these signal words. Another idea of cohesion is using synonyms and repeated or rephrased ideas to connect information together. And really kind of helping us understand that a good TOEIC or TOEFL essay includes many examples of cohesion to show how these ideas connect to each other. So let's look at a first example of using cohesion when it comes to signal words. And this is one that we've talked about already, and that is connecting the topic sentence to the thesis. If you recall, we tried to use a couple of ideas to show just exactly how the rest of the essay is going to connect to our introduction. Well, again, our thesis is the last sentence of the first paragraph of the introduction, and talking about how we would like to explore the lessons we learned in life, and how they showed us that team sports have much more to teach than individual ones. So again, notice the idea here is we connected in two ways. First off, we used good sequence words like first, but then we also used the same word, lesson and lessons. And notice in the second topic sentence, we also followed up with the second lesson as well. So again, we have to make sure that in our topic sentence we use good signal words, because this shows how the ideas we're including in the body connect to the thesis. So again, sequence words, for example, such as first, second, next, finally. In addition, notice how we used similar or even the same words from the topic sentence to the thesis. This also can help promote cohesion. So again, notice how we repeated the words lesson, which connects back to the exact same word lessons in the thesis. Our second example is looking at using signal words, but inside the body paragraph. So again, notice as we just focus on the first paragraph of the body. Again, let's start with the topic sentence, but this time instead of noticing how the topic sentence connects to the thesis, let's see how the topic sentence connects to the rest of the paragraph. So first off, we have that word first lesson, and as we said before, that's the step in a sequence, the first of something. So what exactly does that signal do for the rest of the paragraph? Well, the first thing we need to recognize is that when we use signals, sequence signals, especially in the topic sentence, they're probably going to control the ideas that are going to follow it. So in the topic sentence, for example, the signal, the first lesson, indicates that the whole paragraph that follows will probably be about this idea. This type of signal we often refer to as the controlling idea of the paragraph. So again, let's go back for a moment and notice, and I've underlined what was exactly that first lesson was. It was the value of teamwork. Well, notice how it's going to control the rest of the paragraph. So as we continue to read through the paragraph, notice how everything seems to relate to it. It's talking about being a point guard on a team, the strengths and weaknesses of the people on that team, and what you had to do on that team to get an advantage. And then, of course, to notice sometimes when you would have to take advantage of using your own skills. So notice how this particular sequence is controlling the whole paragraph. The whole paragraph is about the value of teamwork. So this demonstrates what we're talking about by a controlling idea, and that controlling idea is something we find in the topic sentence. Now notice the other signal words that follow. So look at even in the second sentence. As the point guard on the team. Well, this particular signal is an example. And in other words, it helps connect to the idea of, well, what do we mean by teamwork? Well, the thing about example signals is they actually accomplish two things at the same time. They connect to the idea that came before it, and then they're followed by information that is usually more specific than the information before the signal. So in our example, what we were trying to demonstrate was that teamwork was the more general idea, but the example helps to choose a more specific idea to demonstrate that. Now, let me show you this in a visual way. Let's imagine for a moment that we have a big bunch of candy. So first off, imagine that the word candy here, this idea of candy, represents teamwork. You see, there are many different examples of teamwork that we could pull out from this very general category to demonstrate. So imagine for a moment that the lesson of teamwork is similar to this big bunch of candy. And then we decide to pull out one piece of candy. Well, this piece of candy, which again, it's unique, for example, this is a piece of gum, but it also belongs to the category of candy. So what it does is it helps demonstrate something specific, but also something as typical of the general idea. See, playing basketball is an example of a team sport. So in this case, I got a little more specific by using my own personal example of playing basketball. So this type of example signal, again, as we said, as a guard on the basketball team, it shows how something still belongs to the larger group while also being something more specific. And that's what a good example signal will do. It will take something small from a larger idea, but use it to demonstrate characteristics that belong to the bigger idea. Okay, the third type of signal and transition is to notice how they connect paragraphs to each other. So paragraphs that might be related, for example, and again, if you remember, we actually took two paragraphs to explain our first idea, and that was the idea of teamwork and how there's value in teamwork. Well, I've highlighted two signals here, right at the first sentence, again, the topic sentence of the second paragraph, and those words are much like and as well. So what do those signals mean? Well, those signals belong to the category of comparison. So the comparison signal phrase, much like, helps to indicate that while we are changing from one world, which was the world of sports, to another, the world of work, the ideas are still similar. So this is reinforced by the use of the phrase as well, which means in addition to, or even can mean in the same manner or way, or even equally. So notice how these two signals are working together to reinforce the same idea. So what this means is that we still haven't left the idea being made in the paragraph before it. In other words, the controlling idea of teamwork, as described in the topic sentence of the first body paragraph, is directing this paragraph too. So we haven't changed anything, we're just adding more information. So what do we notice so far? Well, again, signal words and transitions are important ways to show how ideas connect to each other, kind of like a roadmap or directions for us. So when they are used correctly, they can help promote a stronger sense of cohesion because they help the reader follow a logical progression of ideas in the essay. So in our sample body, we were able to show this progression by demonstrating how the first body paragraph relates to the thesis, and then how the second paragraph builds on the first body paragraph. So again, in our sample essay, just to give a quick outline, we said in our thesis lessons why team is better than the individual sports. Our first body paragraph says that lesson 1 is the value of teamwork, and our example is playing point guard. In our second body paragraph, we continue the idea of teamwork, and this time we connected it to the real world of work. So again, notice how the first idea is controlled by the topic sentence, teamwork, but so is the second paragraph. It is also controlled. So again, notice that both of these paragraphs basically work together. They basically are answering that first idea, that teamwork is what we're learning here. And again, part of the idea was because we felt like our paragraph was getting too long. So we divided it into two paragraphs. The second idea of cohesion is when we use synonyms and or repeated and rephrased ideas. So let's start with repeated or rephrased ideas first. So another way to help ideas connect, so not just using signal words, but then one way we can do is to use the exact same words or phrases. A similar concept is to take a different form of the same word and to rephrase it a slightly different way. So we're going to look at our two examples here again and see if we can identify some repeated and rephrased ideas. So I've got the two paragraphs now side by side. They're next to each other. And hopefully we've looked at them enough that we have a basic idea of how they connect to each other. But first off, we're going to use light blue to demonstrate the words that I've just repeated from one paragraph to the other. So for example, there's the word teamwork, the word team, strengths and weaknesses, and the word no. Now, of course, there are other words too, but these are kind of the important words that we're trying to focus on here. Now I'm going to use orange to demonstrate words that are rephrased, or kind of said basically in a different way. So for example, if you'll notice, the word teammates and different players on the team are basically the same idea. And then notice in the other paragraph, we restated that by saying members on the team. Again, in the work world, we don't have players, we call them members. The word value, if you notice in the first paragraph, is rephrased as valuable. And of course, needed is essentially just the past tense form of the simple form of need. So again, notice what we're trying to do. By rephrasing or even repeating certain words, we're showing how these two paragraphs largely connect to each other. And we don't necessarily had to use a lot of signal words. If you'll notice, we've just used a few signals. But this also helps promote an idea of these ideas kind of connecting to each other. Now let's talk about synonyms. Synonyms are words or ideas that are similar in meaning, and often can be substitutes for each other in the right context. And that last part's very important. Synonyms are especially helpful when you're writing an essay, because part of the problem is oftentimes we just repeat the same words over and over again. Now, are there any synonyms in our two body paragraphs? Well, let's look a little more carefully. Well, in this paragraph, we really only used about one kind of pair of synonyms, and that's understand and the word know. Well, again, this brings us to a trick that we have to think about. We don't want to repeat ourselves on an essay. So in our sample essay, even though we've done a good job showing how closely the two paragraphs relate to each other, the problem might be that we have too many repeated words, because that might get a little boring to the reader, and of course especially to the person who's going to be reading this essay and evaluating you. Yes, the test evaluator. Being a good writer depends a lot on having a good vocabulary, so one where you won't have any difficulty in finding things to say without repeating yourself. Well, I think this is a good time for us to play a little activity, and one that'll help us kind of just get started in thinking about the importance of words, and this activity we call Synonym Wars. So let's talk about the rules. In this activity, you're going to see a series of fairly common words. And again, these are words that maybe you use all the time, words that oftentimes we find in the TOEIC and TOEFL essays, but perhaps a little too general. So our objective here is to see, well, how good is your vocabulary? Can you identify two synonyms of these words as quickly as possible before the time runs out and moves on to the next word? Now, you'll notice on the right of the screen, there's an online form that you can use to play along. So look to the right of this video to find the Synonym Wars form. And we're going to try an example here just to get you kind of familiar with how to play this game. So let's try an example. So find the example on the online form to the right. So our example word is understand. Now quickly look and see from your four choices which two are synonyms of this word. I'll give you a few seconds to look. Okay, here are the answers. Perceive and comprehend are two words that could be synonyms for the word understand. Now, in our real game, remember your time is going to be limited. So now you need to click ahead to go to number 1, And remember, you have to choose 2 answers from the list. And when the game is finished, you'll be able to see your answers and your answers and the correct answers. So are we ready? Remember, again, you have just only about 8 to 10 seconds to move on from one word to the next. So here we go. The first word is keep. Number 2, earn. Number 3, want. Number 4, like. Number 5, look for. Number 6, guess. Number 7, fun. Number 8, good. Number 9, show. And number 10, make. So how did you do? Again, you should be able to see your choices and the correct answers after you finish. Now, organization is still important on the TOEIC and TOEFL, but the essays with the higher evaluations are the ones that are generally more interesting and well written, and I believe that this most closely connects to vocabulary. So keep in mind, synonyms are rarely perfect substitutes. Many word uses depend on the context they're in. So keep in mind that just because a particular word may have more than one synonym doesn't mean that it can be used in any situation. For example, in our game we just learned that the word retain is a synonym for keep, but you wouldn't be able to use it as a substitute in the idiomatic expression that we're using here, keep in mind. So for example, you wouldn't say retain in mind, even though keep and retain have a similar meaning. So please visit the Writing Resources page and practice a little bit more by improving your vocabulary with some of the links and activities that are posted there. Now we're moving on to the concept of paragraph unity. So the first thing we have to understand is that using signal words and transitions repeatedly, and using repeated and rephrased and synonymous ideas, this is beginning to demonstrate how connected our 2 body paragraphs really are. Now, the thing, though, to think about is since all of the sentences in the paragraph are talking about the same idea and are sharing many of the same or similar language, this kind of helps promote a strong sense of unity or togetherness throughout the essay. So if there are sentences or even paragraphs that don't belong, this can complicate your point and confuse the reader. So we're going to try another little activity about unity, and it's an activity we like to call Reunify. Now in this activity, we're going to see a paragraph from an essay. Now not our essay, but just another sample paragraph. And our objective is to identify which sentence or sentences are not unified with the rest of the ideas in the paragraph. Now this paragraph will also appear on the screen, but you can also find it below this video. So if you look below the video on the screen, you should see a copy of this paragraph as well, and that way you can read it without having to read it on the screen. And again, this paragraph was adapted from a particular textbook that I like to use in class from time to time. It's by Ann Hogue, and it's called The Essentials of English, a Writer's Handbook. So if you don't have a good writing handbook, this one's especially designed for ESL students. So I might recommend this book if you don't have it already. Okay, so here's our paragraph, how to meet people. So in just a moment, what I'm going to recommend is that you pause the video and then read the paragraph either on the screen or below so that you can kind of identify which sentence or sentences don't belong. And then when you're ready, play the video again and then we'll check our answers. So now pause the video. Okay, so have you read the paragraph? Then here we go. So, first off, again, the idea is that the paragraph is largely talking about this experiment using dogs and walking dogs to meet people. So as we look closer, we're trying to identify sentences that don't belong to the paragraph. The ones that largely are not talking about that idea. The sentences might be interesting or might even contain information we would like to know, but information that clearly doesn't belong to the main topic that the person's talking about. So the first idea is the sentence that says, she lives near the university where she works. Notice that this information is really not necessary to explaining the overall idea of talking about psychologists walking a dog. And in fact, notice it introduces the word she, yet we still don't know if any of the psychologists are actually women. So in this problem, we notice that we have a pronoun, she, that doesn't seem to belong or describe anything, and also information about living near the university that has nothing to do with the dog experiment itself. So there's one sentence that we could eliminate. Are there any others? Well, in fact, there's one more that doesn't quite fit. And that's the idea that scientists didn't use cats or other pets in the experiment. You see, in this case, all of the paragraph so far has been talking about dogs. So in this case, this sentence doesn't belong to this paragraph. Now, could we have included it perhaps in a different paragraph, talking about cats or other pets? That's most possible. That certainly is possible here. But in this case, since all of the sentence, or all of the paragraph rather, is talking about dogs and how they fit into the paragraph, it probably would not belong here. So in this case, these are the two sentences that don't belong in this paragraph. Now, again, visually, let's try to use another kind of candy idea here, and using the idea of a chocolate bar. And notice this chocolate bar has many different pieces. So I want you to imagine first is that the whole chocolate bar, this is like our essay. So when we break off a larger piece of the chocolate bar, let's think of this as a body paragraph. And we want that body paragraph to belong to the rest of the essay. So again, think about it like this. The paragraph here is still made of chocolate. It still looks a lot like the rest of the essay, but it also is separate from the essay, which means it's kind of its own idea as well. Well, that's part of the idea, is that the whole essay we want to be kind of the same idea. So think of it like the same chocolate, so to speak. So even after we separate it, though, we can still recognize, okay, it relates to the rest of the essay, but it's also separate from it. So that's the thing about paragraphs, is that they have their own particular ideas, but they still belong to the rest of the main idea you're trying to make. Now, what would happen if we break the paragraph, or in this case the chocolate piece, into smaller pieces? Well, again, they would still be unique and still have ideas that belong to the paragraph, but then now they're still largely, again, separate. Well, we're going to call these sentences. So again, the sentences we're getting smaller. So we start with the paragraph idea, then we kind of focus on the sentences, but we still recognize they all belong to the same general main idea. Now, if we break them into even smaller pieces, well, this would kind of refer to the words we choose. Again, the words, they're unique, but they're all still part of the same idea. So this is kind of a visual way to represent the concept of unity. Even though they all belong to the same essay, they all need to also have individual ideas that they're describing. But those ideas still need to belong to the big idea of the whole topic. So again, even though they're all made of chocolate, they all kind of have individual things that we can identify. So, when we're being unified, It's important to keep in mind, though, that sometimes it's difficult to go back and check for unity because part of the problem is, on the TOEIC and TOEFL, we don't have a lot of time. So that's why it's important when you're writing to think about and to make sure that all of your sentences, paragraphs, and ideas, they all stay on topic. Now, one thing we talked about earlier, if you feel that your paragraph is getting too long, you also might want to consider, again, making sure you don't have any unnecessary words or ideas or sentences. And you also might want to do what we did earlier, which was divide into 2 paragraphs, especially if we are moving from something personal to the reason we're trying to make. Of course, this is usually not a problem that many students have on the TOEIC or TOEFL because oftentimes many students have difficulty reaching 300 words. But this is something to think about when we're talking about unity. So what have we learned so far in our video? Well, good writers use cohesive ideas. So in order to be cohesive, we need to include appropriate signal words and transitions to help paragraphs and sentences flow together. We need to use synonyms, rephrased ideas, and even repeated ideas or words to connect information together, especially to connect the topic sentence to the thesis, and connect ideas throughout the whole body. In order to write a unified essay, it's important to remember to make sure that every body paragraph is addressing the thesis in some way. Now you notice we had 2 paragraphs, and one paragraph was directly addressing the thesis, and the other was kind of connecting to another body paragraph. Again, that's fine. You can either directly or indirectly connect to the thesis, but as long as they're staying on topic. Also, make sure that every sentence in the body paragraph is talking about the controlling idea in the topic sentence, and not about something that's unrelated. And finally, make sure that the words you choose are words that are also appropriate to the topic and the ideas as well. Now, this won't be easy, but I believe as long as you do stay on topic, you probably won't have much difficulty choosing the right words. But of course, as we said before, using good vocabulary can often help us. Now it's your turn. Click on the link at the bottom of the page to do this activity on cohesion and unity. When you're finished, go to the next video, Day 4, Part 2. Good luck!